Hello, this is again Dr. Jonathan Ben-Tovish. I'm recording a very important presentation today, following again the publication of God's Physics new book published by iUniverse.com. The title of today's presentation is that God's Physics new 21st century scientific paradigm is leading the world into Giula. And it's a very important presentation because, as we all know, the world is in a crisis, especially with the crisis in Ukraine. So this presentation, as well as all the previous presentations, are really geared towards not just scientists, but even more so towards the whole of humanity. And this new God's Physics paradigm, which again I'm gonna just highlight the breakthrough in science, and especially focus today's presentation on the understanding that this new God's Physics paradigm gives a tremendous hope and a direction and a new understanding of how the universe operates, how our world operates, and in a sense the new understanding of God's Physics paradigm, which is that there exists only one singular higher ordered reality. That higher ordered reality, which is called in scientific terms universal consciousness reality, and is creating the world many billions or even trillions of times per second, creating the whole universe as one reality, as one frame, one picture. That universal conscious reality, which is sustaining, evolving, and creating the universe all the time, is leading the universe towards a perfected Geulah state. Geula is a term taken from the Jewish Hasidic knowledge, but in any event, in scientific terms, that Geula, perfected state, is essentially a state in which humanity, science, and the whole of humanity will recognize the oneness of creation, the oneness of and the singularity of this higher ordered universal conscious reality, which is characterized by morality, by oneness, by unification, by all goodness. So and that's extremely relevant now for the crisis in Ukraine, and more generally for the fact that this new God's Physics scientific paradigm of the 21st century is really leading humanity towards that perfected state, and it's urgently needed by humanity, by our whole world, to realize this new understanding, scientific understanding, which positions humanity in a completely different situation, or a completely different state, this perfected beginning of this perfected Geulah state. So let me state briefly again, and I'm referring people both to this God's Physics iUniverse God's Physics book published by iUniverse.com. I wrote it for the general layman population and readership, and also all the many videos that I recorded, which are available online, that are explaining much more in detail this scientific revolution. But in this video I'll do it very briefly. I'll just state that we're standing at a historic point, which is equivalent to Einstein's revolution 100 years ago. And again, this is geared towards the general population. It's not just for scientists, but it's relevant. This new understanding of science, it's a profound new understanding, and that's why it's very important that it reaches all of humanity. So the scientific revolution that we're standing at today is a historic scientific revolution. It's of the magnitude of Einstein's general relativity theory 100 years ago. And I'm saying that because there are already two initial empirical validations of this new scientific paradigm of God's Physics theory, which is equivalent to what happened 100 years ago in 1919, when Eddington, the famous British astronomer, verified a specific prediction of Einstein's general relativity theory. In that case, it was about Mercury's pathway around the sun, which was double valued according to Einstein's general relativity theory, as opposed to Newtonian mechanics, due to Einstein's general relativity theory, new understanding that massive objects curve space and time. But in any event, when Eddington in 1919 solar eclipse was able to verify and validate that in fact the value predicted by Einstein's theory, general relativity theory, was more accurate, the 1.6 arc was actually the value that Eddington found, rather than Newton's prediction of 0.8 arc. That moment signified the triumph of relativity theory, and it became the acceptable and the accepted new paradigm for 20th century physics until today. Now the problem is that, again, without going into too many details, the problem is that science has reached again paradigmatic crisis, a situation in which the two basic pillars of science, relativity theory about the macroscopic universe and quantum mechanics about the microscopic realm, they seem to contradict each other. That's equivalent to what happened 100 years ago before Einstein came up with his general relativity theory, in which Maxwellian theory and Newtonian classical mechanics seem to contradict each other. And when we reach that state, there is a paradigmatic crisis. The old paradigm, in this case of general relativity theory, again about the universe, the big universe, and quantum mechanics about the small universe, the microscopic realm. When we reach that state of crisis, then science has to make a leap. And a leap meaning, as I said earlier, as I explained in previous videos, it's like expanding from our understanding of a room, as if the whole universe is just a room. Then we open the door and we see that the room is okay, the room exists, but it exists within, embedded within a house, and the house is embedded within a neighborhood, etc. That's the expansion of knowledge, or the broadening of scientific understanding of the universe. And that's where we stand, because that crisis between relativity theory and quantum mechanics inevitably leads to the search for, and thank God, the finding of the new scientific paradigm, which is God's physics. It was called earlier the computational unified field theory. I called that this theory previously the computational unified field theory, in great respect for Einstein's visionary quest for such a unifying field theory between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. Again, Einstein was the great genius that discovered general relativity theory, considered to be the greatest intellectual achievement achieved by one individual human being. But still, Einstein recognized that there is a contradiction or a theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and therefore he sought out to find, he was on a quest to find that unifying field theory. And people at the time even mocked him for doing that, but he proved out to be correct. And his unifying field theory, initially I called it the computational unified field theory, again in tribute to his great visionary quest for truth. He wasn't concerned about what people would say about him, he was concerned about finding truth. That's a truly great scientist. And so I called the theory initially the computational unified field theory. Now, over the past few years, it's been changed the name for God's physics. But in any event, this new God's physics paradigm is essentially unifying relativity theory and quantum mechanics. It's resolving that inconsistency. It's discarding dark matter, dark energy, which is a purely hypothetical concept that are supposed to comprise up to 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe. This is equivalent to the ether concept, which was supposed to perfuse the universe before Einstein came along, and scientists couldn't find it back then. Scientists can't find right now, for the past 20 years, the dark matter, dark energy, and Einstein canceled the ether concept. That was part of his theory, general theory of relativity revolution. And I did the same thing. I discarded dark matter, dark energy as superfluous, as non-existent. I'm mentioning the fact that Scientific American, the famous scientific journal, came out with an article over the last few months whose title was "The Last Stand of Dark Matter, Dark Energy," essentially saying that if scientists could not find it for the past 20 years, then it's probably not existent, or at least they have to find it very soon. In my theory, I've already discarded dark matter, dark energy, also on theoretical grounds. And in any event, the new theory, the point that is important for us right now is that this new theory has now reached the point which is equivalent to Eddington's verification of Einstein's general relativity theory as more valid than the previous theory, which was Newtonian mechanics. And we stand at exactly the same equivalent point, because, as I mentioned, there are two initial empirical validations of this new God's theory, God's physics theory. And without going into details, one of them is the non-continuous increase or acceleration of the universe's expansion. That non-continuous acceleration of the universe's expansion is a unique prediction of God's physics paradigm, which is contradicting actually dark matter, dark energy. According to general relativity theory, the universe's expansion rate should be constant. It's accelerated, but it's constant. According to the new God's physics paradigm, the rate of the universe's expansion should increase. And again, without going into too many details, that ensues from one of the realizations of the new theory, which is, as I said, there exists a higher ordered, singular, universal computational or consciousness principle. That UCP, universal consciousness principle, is creating the whole universe as an extremely rapid series of frames. Imagine that you're seeing a film, and you're seeing a plane zooming through the screen, and it seems that the plane has a lot of velocity, and you can even measure the velocity of the plane on the screen. But lo and behold, when you stop the film, you see that the plane itself doesn't have any energy. It's just displaced. It's presented at one frame here, and then in a different point, and then a different point, and then when you project the frames very quickly, very rapidly, it seems that the plane has a velocity. And that's a metaphor, the cinematic film metaphor that I'm using, essentially to illustrating the fact that this new God's physics paradigm has discovered an amazing new concept, an amazing new reality, which is pointing at the existence of this singular, higher ordered universal computational / consciousness principle, UCP. That universal consciousness principle or reality is producing each time, each billionth of a billionth or a trillionth of a second, is producing a frame, just like in the film. The whole universe is one picture, three-dimensional picture, of course. And then between one frame and the subsequent frame, the whole universe dissolves back into this universal consciousness principle. And that universal consciousness principle is computing, is creating the whole universe simultaneously. So I'm saying this because that prediction, the unique critical prediction of the God's physics new paradigm, essentially saying that this universal consciousness principle is also sensitive, or is responding, or is affected by what I call collective human consciousness focus, meaning that when you have a large group of human beings, in the case of the Jewish Rosh Hashanah New Year, millions of Jews are focusing on this universal conscious reality or principle. In religious terms, we would call it God. But in any event, when we have this situation that millions of individuals, and I've focused initially on the Jewish Rosh Hashanah, and I predicted that during the Jewish Rosh Hashanah, which is an instance of collective human consciousness focus, there will be a leap, an increase, a non-continuous increase in the rate of the universe's expansion. So whenever we have this universal collective human consciousness focus that is focusing on this universal conscious reality, we have this increase in the rate of the universe's expansion. That's why I called, and I'm still calling, for cosmologists and astronomers all over the world to test and see whether in fact around the Jewish Rosh Hashanah last year, it was on September 27th and 28th, 2021. So to test and examine whether in fact around that Jewish Rosh Hashanah 2 days special time interval of September 27th, 28th, 2021, whether in fact there's been a non-continuous increase in the rate of the universe's expansion. In other words, that during and after these 27th, 28th of September 2021, there will be an increase, non-continuous increase in the rate of the universe's expansion. Excuse me. So the first critical prediction of God's physics new paradigm is that there is a non-continuous increase in the universe's expansion rate, and specifically, as I mentioned, I have been calling, and I'm still calling, cosmologists and astronomers to verify that very specific, unique prediction. And at this point, I'll also mention my personal email, which is Dr. Bentwich, all lowercase letters, DRBENTWICH @gmail.com. And I'm encouraging cosmologists, astronomers, and more generally, by the way, the leading universities, physics universities, to collaborate with me and communicate with me and assist me in further validating this amazing new paradigm of physics for the 21st century. But regardless of this specific prediction around the Jewish Rosh Hashanah, what has been verified, and that's why I'm saying we're standing at an equivalent point to Eddington's verification of relativity theory 100 years ago. So we already have an empirical validation of that non-continuous accelerated expansion in the universe's rate of expansion. And that validation is given by a riddle that's not been resolved, but it's a major finding. It's a validation of that critical prediction. And that riddle is what I call the cosmological astronomical gap in the universe's expansion rate. So it's a growing enigma in science, which does not have any explanation according to relativity theory. That's why it's an enigma. But that enigma is that when cosmologists and astronomers compare the rate of the universe's expansion from the beginning of the universe, which is the background radiation assumed to ensue from the Big Bang initial nuclear event, when we measure the rate of the universe's expansion as measured by the background radiation, that would be the cosmological early stage or early state measurement of the universe's expansion rate. And we compare that to the rate of acceleration, to the rate of expansion, accelerated expansion of the universe today. When astronomers measure today the farthest reaches of the universe, the galaxies, even at the tip of the universe, and they measure today's acceleration rate of the universe, they find a much higher rate today than at the beginning of the universe. That conforms and that validates, that supports, it conforms and validates the unique prediction of God's physics paradigm, which says that the universe expansion rate would increase non-continuously, it would increase over time. So that's supporting God's physics critical prediction of a non-continuous accelerated rate of expansion of the universe, which is increasing over time, but does not support general relativity theories, Einstein's equations, which essentially says the rate of the universe's expansion remains constant. It may be accelerated, but it's accelerated at a constant rate. It's not increasing over time. So this is one initial validation of God's physics critical prediction of the non-continuous accelerated expansion. Again, I would be more than happy to communicate with astronomers and cosmologists that would rally and share with me results specifically about the leap or the non-continuous accelerated expansion around the Jewish Rosh Hashanah. But regardless, even before those positive results, I believe, will arrive, there is a validation, a more general validation of God's physics critical prediction regarding the non-continuous accelerated expansion, which is negating and is different principally from general relativity theory's prediction that the universe would expand at a constant rate, a constant accelerated rate, but still a constant rate. The second validation of God's physics new paradigm is about what I call the proton radius puzzle. Without going into details, that's actually on the microscopic realm, so that would be a validation of God's physics paradigm as more valid also than quantum mechanics, which is the old model relating to the subatomic realm. And that proton radius puzzle finding, again, the name itself denotes that it's a riddle, it's an enigma, it's a puzzle for quantum mechanics, for the old paradigm. Essentially, when we compare the two atoms, the hydrogen atom, in which we have a proton and a neutron at the nucleus, and then the electron, negatively charged particle, encircling that nucleus, and you compare that to a situation where you replace the electron, the negatively charged particle, with a muon, also negatively charged particle, but that particle, the muon, is much more massive than the electron, and it has an effect on the nucleus, on the proton in the nucleus, the radius of the proton. So what the proton radius puzzle essentially is telling us that when we examine the proton in these two situations, in the standard hydrogen atom, which is encircled by the electron, and in the altered hydrogen atom, which is with a muon replacing the electron. In the case of the muon hydrogen atom, we have the proton shrinking in its radius and becoming also much more accurate, the measurements themselves. That is a riddle, the proton radius puzzle. It cannot be explained by quantum mechanics. But in terms of God's physics new paradigm, it's exactly predicting that result. Again, there is a more specific prediction, which I'll mention, that I'm calling subatomic accelerator physicist, experimental physicist, to verify and validate that more specific prediction, which I'll get into in a second. But even more generally, you see, the thing is, because God's physics new paradigm, as I said, discovers this amazing new discovery about the singular higher ordered universal computational / consciousness principle, the UCP, which is simultaneously computing every frame of the universe. It's dissolving the universe in between frames, and then it's creating a new frame which is a little bit larger than the previous frame, and it's doing it many trillions of times per second, which is almost inconceivable in our minds, but still that's what the new God's physics paradigm is telling us. So when that universal computational principle or consciousness principle, UCP, computes every point in the universe, it computes for that point the four basic physical features of space, energy, mass, and time. It's computing it through three computational dimensions. I won't get into that now. But let's focus on one of those physical features, which is mass. And the idea is that the UCP computes the mass of every given particle based on the degree of its consistency when you measure the object, the particle, and you compare that particle's constituting elements or values between one frame and another frame over a series of frames. The mass value that the UCP gives or computes or creates for every particle is a function of how much consistent spatial consistency there will be for that particle. In other words, a more massive particle would be presented across more frames, and during those more frames it would be presented more spatially consistent. If I have to explain it in simple terms, there's an equation, etc. So that means that a more massive particle, such as a muon, would be presented more spatially consistent, or smaller, if you will, and more accurate and appearing across more frames than a less massive particle such as the electron. So that explains and predicts precisely the findings of the proton radius puzzle, because according to the new God's physics paradigm, it's predicting actually that the more massive muon particle would be measured as more as smaller, as more precise, and as appearing across more frames than the electron. And because the muon particle is affecting and perhaps sinking into the proton particle, it's affecting the proton particle, so it's in a sense causing the shrinkage or the more spatially consistent measurement of that proton radius because of the muon, which is more massive than the electron. So we have another verification, direct validation, initial validation of God's physics' unique critical prediction, which cannot be explained, let's say, by quantum mechanics. In quantum mechanics, there's no explanation for that. That's why it's called a riddle, the proton radius puzzle or riddle, and it's not been resolved now for the past over 10 years. So we have two empirical validations of this new God's physics paradigm, and that's why essentially what I'm saying is that first of all, we've reached a point where the new God's physics paradigm is exactly equivalent to Einstein's relativity theory. In other words, the same way that Eddington's validation of one unique critical prediction of relativity theory, which was, as I mentioned, the more curved pathway of Mercury around the Sun, that was validated by Eddington, conforming to Einstein's prediction, that was more valid than Newtonian prediction. At that point, scientists, the whole world had to accept relativity theory, general relativity theory, as a new paradigm for 20th century physics. We are standing at exactly an equivalent point where scientists, the whole of humanity, are accepting and have to accept this new God's physics paradigm as the satisfactory new paradigm for 21st century physics. God's physics is more accurate. The predictions, the critical predictions of God's physics, new theory, new paradigm, which is about the non-continuous accelerated rate of expansion of the universe, and that's the macroscopic world. And on the microscopic level, the quantum level, the new God's physics paradigm has been validated because its prediction about the proton radius puzzle is more accurate than the prediction of quantum mechanics, which cannot explain that proton radius puzzle. And before forgetting to relate to that, let me just mention here that I called subatomical accelerators physicists, experimental physicists, to measure a more direct, again, a critical prediction, which is that if they measure across a series of frames, they measure how many times the muon, more massive muon particle, would be measured across a series of frames, as opposed to the electron across the same series of frames, they would find, the prediction is, that the muon particle would be detected, exists across a much greater percentage or number of these frames. In a sense, it's a sampling, because it's a sample of a certain number of frames, because the rate of the UCP's rate of production of the frames is much quicker, much more rapid than what we can measure in subatomic accelerators. But still, when we sample a certain, what I call minimal time interval or fine temporal measurement of a series of frames, we would find the prediction is that the muon particle would be detected across a much greater, many more times the muon particle will be detected across this minimal time frame than the electron. And when they verify that, that will be even a more direct empirical validation of God's physics paradigm. But regardless, we're standing at a point where scientists, humanity as a whole, is accepting, and we have to accept this new God's physics paradigm as the new satisfactory scientific paradigm for 21st century physics. So this is a very exciting time. Now, as I said in the beginning of this important video, today is a very important presentation, because we stand at not just scientifically at a historic turning point, where the world, scientists have to accept and are accepting God's physics new paradigm. It's a revolution of the magnitude of what Einstein accomplished with his general relativity theory. That's an exciting, very exciting development. But the thing is, it's extremely relevant for humanity, and also what's happening now in Ukraine. Humanity is now, in a sense, reaching or starting to enter a new state, which is discovered and is, in a sense, affecting the whole world, the whole of humanity, the whole world, which is discovered by God's physics new paradigm. So I want to devote the second half of this important presentation. Excuse me. I want to devote the second half of this important presentation about God's physics new scientific paradigm, leading the world and humanity to the Geulah State, the Prefected Geulah State, to explain on the human level, on our human consciousness level, human lives level, the implications of this new God's physics paradigm, and how it's so relevant for humanity to start opening our eyes and realizing that our whole world is changing and has to change according to this new realization of God's physics. So let me explain this briefly, or try to explain this briefly. I would say that the shift, the paradigmatic shift from the old paradigm, which I call the material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics, to the new, what I call acausal computation paradigm of God's physics paradigm. If I had to explain that shift, I would say the old paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics, which I call the material causal paradigm, the old paradigm essentially is assuming that everything in the universe operates by cause and effect. The universe is assumed to be created by a Big Bang nuclear event. It's drifting into emptiness, into nothingness, as it were, because the universe is supposed to expand ad infinitum, more and more. The galaxies, the suns, the planets, everything would be drifting apart. The suns would die out, and essentially it's a random a material causal interaction which has created the universe by chance, with no purpose, no meaning, no plan, just an accident. It's drifting the universe, or explaining that the universe will be drifting towards, in a sense, expansion and dissolution, including dissolution of life, etc. And so that's the old paradigm. So relativity theory and the old paradigm, the old material causal paradigm, is essentially saying the universe has been created by chance. It's drifting into emptiness, into nothingness. On the subatomic realm, quantum mechanics, also part of the old material causal paradigm, is also saying everything is random. When you want to measure a certain particle, you'd shoot another, so the target particle, we want to measure where it is, what its properties are. We shoot another subatomic probe particle or wave particle. The interaction between them collapses what's assumed to be the probability wave function of the first target subatomic particle. And first of all, it's probabilistic. We don't know the results beforehand, and it's all probabilistic. There are a lot of phenomena in quantum mechanics which are not easily comprehended there, and they're not logical for sure, but they're sort of not explainable. In any event, but and that's why Einstein, the great scientist, was not pleased with quantum mechanics in its current state, and Einstein predicted and was searching, remember, for this unifying field theory, because he said when the new unifying field theory, or now we call it God's physics paradigm, he said when this unifying field theory would be discovered, quantum mechanics and many of its quirks and things that are sort of not easily understandable and are not really so logical, etc., those would be explained and would be understood in a different way. He said quantum mechanics is not wrong, but it's incomplete. And so quantum mechanics also is based on this old material causal assumption, as if the world is functioning by cause and effect, the target particle hitting the probe particle hitting the target probability wave function, causing the collapse of the probability wave function into a single value. Both of these theories share the assumption that the world is functioning by cause and effect, in a sense almost random. There's no purpose, there's no goal, there's no plan, there's no sense in a sense for things that are happening. It's just material causal interaction. It's random, purposeless, etc. That's the old paradigm. That old paradigm, as we said, has reached a paradigmatic crisis, and it's crashing. It's like the room that has to be expanded. The door has to be open, and the room has to be expanded now into the house. So that's what's happening with God's physics. And God's physics new paradigm is altering science and therefore also humanity's basic understanding of the universe. The new God's physics paradigm is telling us nothing in the universe happens by chance, really. And there's no cause and effect, really. At least it seems as cause and effect, but what's really evolving, sustaining, dissolving, and evolving the universe is only this singular higher order universal consciousness principle, UCP. Without going into details, just again, people can read the book, can look at the previous presentations. because it's an elaborate subject, but because the UCP is computing simultaneously all the pixels in the universe, therefore in no single frame there can be any cause and effect. When things are presented simultaneously or computed simultaneously, there cannot be cause and effect. So within any given frame there's no cause and effect. Between one frame and another there's no cause and effect, because the whole universe dissolves back into this UCP. So we have no cause and effect in the regular way that we're thinking of. It may appear as laws that are related to cause and effect, but those are really sustained and are driven really, this is an appearance, it's not really cause and effect. But what's really driving the universe, what's sustaining the universe, is this universal consciousness principle. Maybe I'll mention one of the 70 plus articles that have been published. That article, peer-reviewed articles, there's been 2 special issues published. I'm opening international conferences in physics and in science about this new 21st century paradigm of God's physics. One of those 70 plus articles that have been published is called A New Atom in a Purposeful Universe. The new atom of the universe is this UCP. So that this is because, think about the fact that all the pixels in the universe are being created simultaneously by the UCP, dissolved between one frame and another to the UCP, then created again by the UCP. So the only thing that remains constant in the universe, constant, continuous, uniform, is this universal consciousness principle, or universal computational principle. This UCP is the only thing that remains constant both during the frames, when it's computing simultaneously all spatial pixels in the universe, and computing for them the 4 basic physical features of space, energy, time, and mass. So the UCP is existing both during the frames, in which it's creating all the universe, all the spatial pixels and their 4 basic physical features, and it's also existing in between one frame and another. Remember that in between one frame and another, the whole universe dissolves back into the UCP. If it's dissolving back into the UCP, that means that the universe, the physical universe, is not constant. We cannot relate to the physical universe as a solid reality. And it means also that the physical universe does not operate by cause and effect, because even our bodies, the planets, everything that we see around us, the birds, the sky, the ground, our cars, our cell phones, our bodies, everything in the universe exists only for a very short period of time, for a trillionth of a second, as computed, as being created by this universal consciousness reality or principle. Then it dissolves back into this UCP. So in between one frame and another, the universe dissolves, it doesn't exist. Therefore, the universe is seen and is understood now only as a transient, phenomenal manifestation of this singular, higher ordered, singular reality of the universal consciousness principle or reality. So the new atom is this UCP. The only thing that exists constantly, the only thing that we may see as real, is constant, is this universal consciousness principle or reality. But everything else in the universe is a manifestation. It's being created, animated, so to speak, by this universal consciousness reality or principle. So we have only one reality, that is the UCP. That UCP is creating the universe and is evolving the universe all the time. So we human beings and animals and plants and inanimate matter, everything in the universe is being created and sustained and evolved, also dissolved in between frames, by this UCP. That changes dramatically our conception of the world. The world is not material causal. There cannot be any cause and effect, really, because everything is created simultaneously by the UCP and it's dissolving between one frame and another to the UCP. So we're opening our eyes, like what the Lubavitcher Rebbe has been telling humanity all along. It appears in Hasidic thought for a long time. But in any event, what the Lubavitcher Rebbe is telling us, to open our eyes and see the reality, that essentially is what science is discovering now. To open our eyes, the new God's physics paradigm is telling us, let's open our eyes and see what the real reality of the universe is. It's not material, it's not causal. The real reality of the universe is this universal consciousness principle reality. So that's an amazing discovery. Now, how is this relevant? How does this change humanity's perspective on life? How is it relevant so much for the Geulah State and for our understanding that what's happening in Ukraine right now, in a sense, is the last remnants of the old paradigm? It has to pass. It is passing. When humanity is opening its eyes and seeing the reality, seeing there's only one universal conscious reality. And the next step is to understand what God's physics telling us. There's with the discovery of this new universal computational principle or conscious reality, UCP, with the discovery of this singular higher ordered universal consciousness reality, we also are discovering that this universal conscious reality has certain characteristics which are key to understanding how it's running the world, and what our part as human beings and as humanity, a leading part we have as partners, as serving this universal consciousness reality. This universal conscious reality is characterized by all goodness. It's characterized by a moral principle. There's a new moral principle in God's physics for the first time in physics, which is called the dynamic equilibrium moral principle. That dynamic equilibrium moral principle is telling us that because this UCP or universal conscious reality is unified, it's oneness. Everything is part of it. There's nothing separate from it. And one of its characteristics are morality. This dynamic equilibrium moral principle, for the first time in physics, is telling us that this UCP has within it what I call a multi-spatial temporal reservoir of all past, present, and multiple possible universal frames. Remember that at every trillionth of a second, there is a universal frame created of the whole universe, created by this UCP. But furthermore, the God's physics new paradigm is assuming that the UCP possesses like a bank of all the film frames, so to speak. When we look at a film and we see it, we stop the film and we see that it's all stored in a DVD. That DVD contains all the frames of the film, even though when we are watching the film, we're seeing only one frame at a time. That's the present frame. The frame that is past is the past frame. The frames that have not been presented are the future frames. So somewhat equivalent, the universal consciousness reality possesses the whole film, so to speak, the whole progression of the universe from the beginning state till the goal state, which I'll talk about, the Giula goal state, the perfected state which humanity is now entering through science. But in any event, the UCP contains that bank of all the frames, which I call the multispatial temporal reservoir of all past frames, universal frames, present frame, and multiple possible future frames. Why do I say multiple possible future frames? Because it's an amazing discovery that God's physics is telling us that the UCP is computing for every individual human being on the planet, every second, actually every trillionth of a second, the next frame, the next present, based on the moral choices that individual human being is making and has been making. In other words, this moral principle is saying, I'm now correcting humanity. I'm correcting every human being and leading humanity towards that perfected Geulah state. The moral principle is essentially telling us that whenever a human being inflicts pain or suffering on another human being, that offsets, so to speak, the balance and the unity of the universal conscious reality. And the dynamic equilibrium moral principle is set into motion a correction of that imbalance. So in other words, when one human being, God forbid, is inflicting pain or suffering on another human being, the universal conscious reality will create, will compute, will plan a future for that individual human being that is inflicted pain, that they will have to, in a sense, experience the same kind of discomfort that they've caused to another human being. By the way, not as a punishment, but as an eye-opener, as a correcting mechanism that would raise our awareness. When when a person suffers, God forbid, they say, why did I do the same thing to another human being? It raises our awareness. It brings us into another term which is called Teshuva in Jewish tradition. Jewish Hasidic tradition, Maimonides, one of the greatest philosophers and leaders in the Jewish tradition, and a doctor, a philosopher himself, he said in Judaism that every person should see themselves as if himself or herself and the whole world are put on the balance scale, and that one positive action of himself or herself, one positive action would tilt himself or herself and the whole universe towards a more positive state, and vice versa, God forbid. So the dynamic equilibrium moral principle is telling us the same thing, that every split second in our life, every human being is making moral choices, and our moral choices, if they're good moral choices, they would lead to the universal consciousness reality selecting for us a positive future, which is equivalent, which is echoing, resonating, encouraging us to continue to go in that good, positive moral choice manner in our life. And vice versa, if we're doing a negative moral action, God forbid, this universal conscious reality would create a situation that would encourage us to open our eyes and have remorse and say, why did I inflict pain on that person? I'm deciding that's Teshuva. I'm making a conscious choice, having remorse, asking forgiveness from that person if I can, and making a moral choice that I would not do this same thing again. That's Teshuva. And again, one of the 70 to 80 articles that have been published and are being published, including 2 now, 3rd special issues supposed to come out. One of those articles, the title of which was The Power of Teshuva, essentially telling us, encouraging us, human beings, individual human beings and humanity as a whole, to make Teshuva, to have this conscious reflection and say, if I've inflicted pain on another human being, I have to have remorse on that. I have to ask forgiveness from that person. I have to make a conscious choice, resolution to try my utmost best next time to do the moral choice, to make the moral choice, the positive moral choice, and not vice versa, not the opposite. And so this dynamic equilibrium moral principle is telling us, is teaching each individual human being to become moral, to realize, and I'm giving another metaphor, the same way that a sane or mentally balanced human being would not take their right hand and inflict pain on their left hand, because it's part of the same person. I would not inflict pain on myself. In a sense, the dynamic equilibrium moral principle is part of this new God's physics, amazing new discovery of how the universe works, new paradigm. God's physics moral principle is essentially leading humanity, each of us individually and humanity as a whole, towards a realization, a perfected Geulah state, a realization that we're not separate from each other, that we are like the right hand and the left hand. I cannot inflict pain on another human being, because that would, first of all, create a future in which I, God forbid, would have to experience something like that. Again, not as a punishment, but as the universal conscious reality awakening humanity and making us open our eyes and see the reality that we're all one. We're all connected to this universal conscious reality. We're inseparable from this universal conscious reality. So it's a major contribution to the new understanding of humanity and the new way in which the world is starting to operate. And the more this God's physics paradigm is being understood and disseminated and being talked about and realized by humanity, it's happening. But the quicker this will happen, the quicker humanity will reach that perfected Geulah state. That's the important point, that the new God's physics paradigm is telling us that with the validation of this new paradigm, as I mentioned earlier, the new validation, empirical validation of this new God's physics paradigm, we realize that we are all integral parts of this universal conscious reality. This universal conscious reality governs the world, is creating the world every trillionth of a second, dissolving the world, the universe, recreating the universe, and is leading the universe towards a perfected Geulah state. The moral principle is a very important part of that Geulah state. So let me talk about this Geulah state, and I'll give another metaphor which I've given before, but it's still a good metaphor, and that is about the way. Think about a king. I gave the metaphor about King Solomon. When King Solomon built the temple, and he built the temple, this immaculate, beautiful, divine temple, he built the temple not by chance, of course. He had a blueprint plan, architectural plan of all the fine details of how the complete divine temple would look like, how it would be constructed, what would it be comprised of. And not only that, he had also a blueprint of what are the stages in order to build that end result, that goal of the complete, beautiful, immaculate divine temple. So we can't imagine a situation, by the way, that he would just send his builders, construction workers, and say, put some brick stones, and then somehow maybe a temple would be constructed. He wouldn't do that. It wouldn't happen. So we realize that to get to that end result of the completed temple, divine temple, King Solomon had to pre-plan the whole development of the universe or directed towards that Geula goal, perfected state. And this is a metaphor for what God's physics is telling us, how the universal conscious reality has pre-planned and is actually executing this pre-planned program to reach the universe and humanity specifically towards that perfected Geulah state. So the same way that King Solomon has, in a sense, executed the whole build-up of the temple from the end result backwards. He has the end result, the blueprint of how the temple has to be constructed and how it has to appear. From that end result, he's now going back and saying, okay, how I'm going to build this towards that end result. And the same thing is happening in God's physics. So the assumption is that I call it the reverse time Geula goal postulate. Excuse me. And the assumption is, or the postulate is, that the universal conscious reality has pre-planned the whole creation of the universe from the end Geula perfected state of humanity backwards. In other words, from the beginning, from the whole plan of the universal conscious reality has been the whole plan of the universe, its evolution until the end result, until the goal of the whole progression and evolution of the universe has been pre-planned and is being executed all the time to reach that perfected state. That means that, for example, it's been planned or pre-planned the whole universe from inanimate matter, animate plants, animals, human beings, and then humanity reaching that perfected Geulah state. That's been pre-planned. So that's again an amazing realization, because we realize the universe is operating, in Hasidic terms it's called personal providence. The universe is operating by personal providence. Everything, every split second in our life and in the universe's creation and recreation, dissolution, evolution, is being pre-planned and is being guided and is being controlled or watched over by this universal conscious reality. We, of course, as human beings, have free moral choice. That's why, in a sense, the whole progression of the universe has been towards that from inanimate matter, plants, animate plants, animals, human beings possessing the most refined and expansive form of consciousness. Key within that is the free moral choice that we have as human beings. But the thing is, so we have a free moral choice, but nevertheless our free moral choice is geared towards, or is intended towards making moral choices and realizing, opening our eyes and realizing that we're all one. We're all part of this oneness of this universal conscious reality, which is characterized by all goodness, morality, peace and harmony, a moral principle, etc., Geulah state. So now we start realizing we can open our eyes, and it's very relevant to the Ukraine crisis, but it's relevant more generally for humanity to start opening our eyes and realizing, when we realize that our moral or immoral actions are essential for humanity to reach that perfected Geulah state, and that we individually are, in a sense, paying the price when we're doing immoral actions, we will have to either make Teshuva. That will be the best option, which the universal conscious reality is encouraging us every split second. Make Teshuva. You can stop if you're doing something which is wrong. You can stop at that instant. Make Teshuva. Ask forgiveness, really, in a sincere manner, and make a resolution not to do that. And by the way, according to God's physics new paradigm, when a person does that Teshuva, that changes, that omits the necessity for that individual human being to experience that negative scenario, which would cause that person to open their eyes. Because when they're making Teshuva, when we're making Teshuva, we are opening our eyes willingly. So it's opening our eyes, and it's telling humanity, listen, we are all part of this universal conscious reality, and we have to operate in a moral sense. And we also realize, by the way, that the universe is not operating, again, just by cause and effect. Darwin's natural selection principle has been negated by this new God's physics paradigm. The world is not operating like a jungle. It's not just force and might. That's not how the universe operates. In a deep way, and for a period of time, that's not how the universe operates. The universe really operates by guidance and by an evolution of this universal conscious reality towards that perfected state. And that perfected state is being guided by this universal conscious reality through the moral principle. But of course, the more we open our eyes, humanity is now encouraged, each one of us individually, and humanity as a whole is encouraged to open our eyes. We have a new scientific paradigm, a new understanding of the universe. That new understanding is telling us nothing is happening by chance. The world and our actions are not happening by chance. The world was not created by chance. It's not drifting into nothingness. It's being guided from the beginning. It's being pre-planned to reach a perfected Geulah state. And the moral principle which is being functioned or being executed by this universal conscious reality is correcting humanity. So we will see less and less of violence, such as what's happening in the Ukraine now. In one of the prophecies of in the Jewish tradition of Isaiah, it was said that during the Geulah state, there would be no wars, there would be no violence. We know about this prophecy, but essentially, it's highlighting, in a sense, the Geulah state, and the Geulah state is where science and humanity is now reaching towards that Geulah state. In the Geulah state, really, there cannot be any violence. Obviously, there's always a possibility of individual human beings not being mentally balanced, and they have to be cared for. They have to be treated. They have to be cared for, and we have to pray that their situation will become better and better, and that they would heal. But those are exceptions to the rule. They have to be cared for, and we have to have a lot of compassion and do everything in the power of medicine and even this new God's physical understanding to assist them to become more mentally balanced. But those are nevertheless exceptions to the rule. The rule is a mentally balanced human being would not inflict pain on themselves. And in the same way, humanity is reaching that new understanding in which, for humanity as a whole, the exception to the rule would be maybe individual human beings that would still opt to act in a violent manner. And because we know this universal conscious reality is correcting immoral actions through the dynamic equilibrium principle, we can be rest assured that those will be corrected, and we pray again that mentally imbalanced human beings would be assisted, and that they would become more mentally balanced, and therefore they would act in a mentally balanced manner. All I'm saying is that the new God's physics paradigm, in a sense, would teach all mentally balanced human beings, the whole of humanity, will reach a state where, in the same way that we would not take our right hand to inflict pain on the left hand, humanity and all human beings, again mentally balanced human beings, the majority of humanity, would realize that the same way that I would not inflict pain with my right hand on my left hand, I would not even fathom a possibility of inflicting pain on another human being, because I realize immediately that there is this moral principle that would balance it. So if I'm inflicting pain on another human being, I will, God forbid, have to experience the same pain unless I make Teshuva, which I have to make Teshuva. So first of all, I would realize that I would not do that. And second of all, I would start opening my eyes. Humanity would open its eyes and see that we're really part of the same universal conscious reality, and it's all goodness. It's moral. So therefore, it would become very natural for humanity, what we're seeing more and more, to have acts of kindness, to take care of each other, to view all of humanity as one big family, and living within that Geula perfected state. So again, I've recorded this video especially because of the Ukraine crisis, but I think because nothing is by chance, everything is by personal providence, that what's been in a sense known in Hasidic Jewish culture and wisdom, and what's being discovered today now by God's physics new paradigm, is that humanity is entering that perfected Geulah state. That perfected Geulah state, with the validation of God's physics new paradigm as more valid than the old paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics, with the acceptance of this new God's physics paradigm, humanity is supposed to open our eyes and see what this new reality is. The new reality is a Geula reality, a perfected moral state in which we understand science and humanity is realizing there's only one reality. That one reality is all goodness, is moral, is characterized by peace and harmony, by giving, by love, by caring. That new reality of God's physics, Geulah state, perfected state, that Geula perfected state is what humanity is opening its eyes and realizing. And the more we are aware of the fact that there is a new paradigm, there's a new understanding of the universe and of our important role as human beings, possessing free moral choice, and in a sense partnering with serving this universal conscious reality, the quicker this Geula perfected state would manifest. And here I'm also praying and wishing for the recovery of all those that have been injured, and for stopping all forms of violence, and really having humanity and the whole world gravitate towards that new perfected Geula state, which is what God's physics new paradigm is discovering. Thank you very much.